Today we're going to do our heart lab. So again, you've got Miss Graham's version where she'll stand and be videoed pointing out the structures, and then I'm going to do a PowerPoint version. And so hopefully with the two labs you can find all your heart structures. So I'm going to go through and we'll see what all we can find. And let me get my pen started. Let's see, what color would you guys like me to use today? Let's go with purple. That's yellow. That's purple. Okay, so we're going to talk about the heart. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about all the structures of the heart. And let's just start talking about the heart wall. So if you imagine, let me just show you, here's the heart. So we want to just take a cross section of the heart wall and talk about that first. Okay, so we can talk about the different parts and layers that make up the heart. So if you think back to your 201 course, your first anatomy, you learned about cavities, and we learned that you have a ventral cavity and you have a thoracic cavity above the diaphragm, and then you have two cavities. You have a pleural cavity, one for each lung, then you have a pericardial cavity, which is where the heart is located. And that pericardial cavity has a membrane lining. So if you remember, you have a double-walled membrane, the serosal membranes, that surround the heart and the lungs. So you had the pleural cavity and you had the pericardial cavity. So if you remember, you had membranes that line those cavities. We call those parietal membranes. And then we have membranes that line or cover the actual organ itself, called the visceral membranes. So on the heart, we had the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. So hopefully you remember that from your earlier course. So let's bring that forward and let's talk about all the different layers that we include when we talk about the heart. So if you were to look inside the heart, okay, so inside the actual chamber here, so we're actually looking at one of the atrium. This is the heart chamber, and the layer that lines that chamber is the endocardium. And it's the same tissue that's going to line your blood vessels. So your blood, as it's going from your blood vessels into your heart, never really changes tissue type. It's in contact with the same type of endothelial layer. It's known as the endocardium when it's in the heart. And then just superficial, as you're kind of moving out toward the outside of the heart, the next layer is the muscle layer, the cardiac muscle layer that we call the myocardium. And then superficial to that, you have what's called the epicardium. Now the epicardium is the same thing as the visceral pericardium. So we're changing the name a little bit. So you learned it as visceral pericardium before, and now we call it the epicardium. So the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium make up the heart wall. Now outside of the heart wall, this is where you have your serosal sac. So the epicardium is going to join and kind of make a sac, a double-walled sac, with the parietal pericardium. Okay, so you have your visceral pericardium, known as the epicardium, and your parietal pericardium, and in between there, that's your pericardial cavity. That's where the serosal fluid is, so that when the heart beats, it allows it not to create friction, so it doesn't get too hot and doesn't rub against anything. So it's a nice kind of friction-free environment for the heart to beat in. And then just deep to that, or superficial to that, closer to the outside of the heart, you have what's called the fibrous pericardium. And it's a very kind of thick layer. And this fibrous pericardium helps protect the heart. It gives it a nice, thick, tough membrane. And it serves as an anchor to anchor the heart to surrounding structures. And it also prevents overfilling. So it just kind of holds the heart and doesn't allow it to overfill, because it's against, almost like a shell, so it kind of holds against the heart. So that's your heart wall, the layers that make up your heart wall. So just a little bit more information about that. The epicardium, again, is that visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The myocardium, again, these are cardiac muscle cells. Okay, so not skeletal muscle, but cardiac muscle. And you also, in the myocardium, you have like a cardiac skeleton. Something has to give the heart its shape, and that's interlacing layers of connective tissue. which will actually allow the heart to have kind of that specific shape that it has. And also it helps support the great vessels and the valves. And also when we talk about cardiac conduction, when we talk about action potentials that travel through the heart, actually it can act as a barrier and limits the spread of some of that cardiac conduction. So you probably haven't heard about that yet, and if you have, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, you'll figure it out, because when you look at the heart, it's got 4 chambers, and electricity needs to flow throughout the heart, and it can't necessarily flow across these connective skeletons, but the heart has a way of doing that, and you'll learn about it when you learn about the cardiac conduction system. Then you have the endocardium, which again is continuous with the endothelial layers of the blood vessels. Okay, it lines the heart chambers, and it covers the cardiac skeleton of the valves. All right. So this is a picture from your textbook, and it's got everything labeled. So I'm not going to sit here and point everything out. You do have this as a reference. So as I'm going forward, you may want to have this particular slide printed out to the side so that you can, check off, okay, that you've learned all these different things. Okay, so this is kind of a reference slide for you. This is looking at the anterior aspect, so the front of the heart. And what you're seeing is the aorta, the inferior superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava, the pulmonary trunk with the pulmonary arteries. You may have already heard about these a little bit when you talked about blood vessels, and we'll talk about them again. You're also seeing the coronary vessels, and these are the vessels that are the blood supply to the heart. You're able to see these are the receiving chambers, so the auricles that make up part of the atria. And then this large area here, this is going to be the pumping part of the heart, the ventricles, a left and right ventricle. So let's identify these structures on a model, because you'll see this on the actual exam. So same picture, just on the model version. So looking at the heart again, this is going to be the left side. This is the right side. This is going to be the left atrium. This is the right atrium in blue. And these little ear-like structures, these are the auricles. So this will be the right auricle and the left auricle. You can make a dividing line right down the middle of the heart. So this will be the left ventricle. This is going to be the right ventricle. Okay. This is the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery. I know it's blue, but it's blue because it's taking blood away from the heart as an artery to the lungs in order to pick up oxygen. So it's a blue artery that's going to the lungs to get oxygen. It divides into a left pulmonary artery and then a right pulmonary artery. You have your superior vena cava, and then you can't see it, but it's right down there is the inferior vena cava. We have our aorta, which has an aortic arch. And if you've covered blood vessels, you should have already learned about the 3 arteries that come off the aortic arch. That should have been covered in a previous lab. So the heart's made up of 4 chambers. Okay, so when you think about, I like to draw the heart like this. Okay, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers. You have 2 superior atria, which are the receiving chambers, so blood comes into the heart, into the left and right atria. The right atrium brings blood from the body, and the left atrium receives blood from the lungs. Okay, then you have 2 inferior ventricles, and these are the ejecting portions of the heart. The right ventricle ejects blood to the lungs, okay, and the left ventricle ejects blood to the body. Okay, so you'll see the right side receives from the body, sends to the lung. The left side receives from the lung and sends to the body. Okay. Again, you have something has to separate these 4 chambers, and those are the septums. So you have an interatrial septum, which separates the 2 atria. You have an interventricular septum, which is going to divide the 2 ventricles, and an atrioventricular septum, which is going to divide the atria from the ventricles. All right, so you can see that a little bit here. So this would be your interventricular septum. The atrioventricular septum would be here and here, okay? And that's where these valves, your mitral valve and tricuspid valve, your tricuspid and bicuspid valve, they kind of pierce through that atrioventricular septum, all right, the one that separates from the top from the bottom. And then there's a wall that separates the two atrium. You have to kind of imagine, you could stick your fingers in and feel that wall. That would be the intraatrial septum. So this is a cutaway of the heart from the front. So here's your right atrium here, this space, left atrium here, right ventricle here, left ventricle here. And so what we're also able to see on this particular slide are the valves. So your heart has 4 chambers and 4 valves. So you have a valve here, this white structure here, 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 and then there's one that's kind of up there, kind of hidden. So you have 2 AV valves, okay, which means atrioventricular valves. You have the mitral or bicuspid valve on the left side. You have the tricuspid valve on the right side. You also have what are called semilunar valves, and so you have the pulmonary, which I like to say pulmonary semilunar valve. It's going to be going to the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve, again, is hidden, so you have the aortic semilunar valve that's hidden, and I'll show you some more pictures of that as well. So you're going to have some images from your textbook and these model pictures, and you can kind of use these to match up your structures. I've also included a separate PowerPoint with just model pictures and also a key. So on the model pictures, you can actually see the numbers on the model. You can look at the key, look at the number, and identify the structure. It's one of the few models that we kind of have the key to share with you guys. They tend to get lost. All right, so let's go back to the atria and talk a little bit more about them. The auricles, if you look at the heart, let me go back. You have these, they look like ears. And so if you think back to 201 and you learned about your hearing, the outside of your ear is called the auricle. So these look like heart ears. So they're appendages, and they allow for increased atrial volume. So perhaps you have more increased venous return to your heart, maybe when you're exercising. You need more area, more volume for that blood to be received in. So those are the auricles. You have a right atrium and a left atrium. And if you were here and we were doing the actual heart lab where we do a dissection of a heart, you can look into the heart and you can see that you have these pectinate muscles that look kind of comb-like, and the right atrium has these pectinate muscles and the left one has them in the auricles. And so if you're looking at a heart and you're trying to figure out if you're in the left or right side, you can find these pectinate muscles, and they look different between the left and the right side, and that's one of the keys that I point out to my students that you should look for when you're doing the dissection, whether or not you're in the left and right, because they have these particular comb-shaped muscles inside the atrium. And they have muscles because the atria are going to contract and force blood down into the ventricles. So blood's going to come in from either the vena cava or the pulmonary veins, fill up the atria. The atria will contract and that blood will go into the ventricles. The atria are very small and thin-walled, and they don't do a whole lot for propulsion of blood. Their job is basically to pump whatever blood into the ventricles. Most blood that enters the ventricle is passive. It simply falls from the atrium into the ventricles. But there's always a little bit of contraction to force the rest of the blood out. So they don't really have, they're not very powerful. You have 3 on the right side. The right atrium is going to receive blood from 3 different veins. It receives it from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is what's going to bring blood back from the heart wall itself. And we're going to talk about the coronary arteries and the coronary veins. So the coronary sinus is what drains the coronary veins, and I'll show you that in just a minute. In the left atrium, 4 pulmonary veins empty into it. Now the ventricles are the discharging chambers. They're the that's hard to say, ejecting chambers. They're thicker, so when you do a dissection, it's really obvious, you know, that these are bigger, thicker walls. It's the biggest volume of the heart, so when you look at the heart, what you're mostly seeing is ventricle. It's really the actual pump is what pumps blood to the lungs, into the body. The right ventricle has a thinner wall than the left ventricle because it doesn't have to pump blood very far. It just pumps it to the lung. So the right ventricle pumps blood to the pulmonary trunk and then to the lungs. the left ventricle. It's going to pump it to the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body, and then that's going to pump, that's going to carry blood all the way through the body, the head, the arms, the toes, the intestines, everywhere. The left ventricle has really noticeable papillary muscles, which will anchor what are called the chordae tendineae, which hold the flaps in place. I'll show you that. Again, when we do these dissections at work or in lab, we have some huge papillary muscles that you can see in the ventricles. So I've given you these structures, so now I'm just going to kind of go through and point out and show you what I'm talking about and give you kind of a review. So we're looking a side view. So this would be the superior vena cava here. This is going to be the right atrium, okay, this whole blue structure. This is going to be the auricle. Okay, these are those pectinate muscles, those comb-shaped muscles that you can see. You can see the inferior vena cava coming out the bottom here. Can you see that? And so you can see this is where the blood would come from the superior vena cava. This is the opening to the inferior vena cava. And this circle here, this is where blood returns from the coronary veins. These are your coronary arteries and coronary veins. So again, all that venous return has to return back to the heart, to the atrium, and it's going to be right here. This hole, this is the hole between the atrium and the ventricle. So your tricuspid valve is going to be right here. And then we have this structure, this number 55, which is called the fossa ovalis. And so we'll cover this a little bit later, a fetal circulation. So when the fetus is inside the mother in utero, it doesn't really need its lungs. The lungs aren't really functioning as part of the respiration process. The placenta is really doing all the exchange. So you've got the umbilical cord, you've got the placenta, so you've got oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange occurring between the mother and the baby at the placenta. So in the fetal circulation, it's really set up to really just bypass the lungs. So some blood goes to the lungs, but most of it just bypasses the lungs altogether and goes straight to the body. And so again, we'll talk about fetal circulation a little bit later, but there's something called a foramen ovale, okay, and we'll talk about that later, a foramen ovale, which is a literal hole between the left and right atrium, which acts as a shunt so that you can bypass the lungs. Well, after birth, this hole will shut down, okay, because now we do need to use our lungs. The baby's crying, it's got to start breathing, and so this hole then, 1 or 2 days will start to shut down. And it leaves a tiny piece of scar tissue there so you can see where it used to be, and that's called the fossa ovalis, okay? There's something else I wanted to point out. This model also has the cardiac conduction system labeled as well. I'll have a few more pictures I'll try to point out, but there's a little white circle right there next to the hinge because your heart really has a hinge. No, it doesn't. That's the SA node, okay, right here. And this other circle, that's the AV node. So they've marked the cardiac conduction system for you as well. And we know this is the aorta, and we know this is the pulmonary trunk. So we're going to zoom in into the right ventricle. So we've opened up the heart. Again, we know we have hinges on our hearts. And we're looking into the right ventricle. Here is the right atrium here. Here's the right ventricle. And so what I'm looking at is the actual valve. That's the tricuspid valve. So tricuspid's on the right. You have these little heartstrings, which is your chordae tendineae, and then they're going to attach into the heart wall using these kind of papillary muscles that hold them in place. So you can see that on the right side. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve. So when the heart contracts, it's going to force blood up to the pulmonary trunk. It's going to go through that pulmonary semilunar valve. Again, they've got the cardiac conduction system labeled. And so you have the right bundle branch, this white bundle branch here, and then the little fibers coming off of it are your Purkinje fibers, okay? To the left side, and we had a little mishap, so I had to tape my heart back together. It was a broken heart. So here's my left atrium and my left ventricle. Again, this is the valve, which would be the, what happened? the mitral valve or bicuspid valve. You can use either one, doesn't matter to me, they're the same thing. With your chordae tendineae, and then again your papillary muscles that are going to hold those in place. Well, it's kind of like a parachute, so you're holding your parachute in place. And you have the left bundle branch, which is the electrical conduction system, and then the Purkinje fibers coming off of that as well. On this one, you can also see some of the pulmonary veins. So these were the left pulmonary veins coming into the left atrium. And if you, it's kind of poor light, but the right ones are coming in. Let me see if I can change color. Right in here. Okay. So again, well, I've shown you the valves, but just to remind you what they are in case maybe I'm not sure where you are in your video watching and in your reading. But remember, you have 4 chambers with 4 valves, and their job is to prevent blood from going in 2 directions. So it allows blood to only go in one direction, or unidirectional blood flow. And so they open and close in response to pressure changes, and you probably have already had some of this in some of your lectures. You have 2 AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, and they will prevent backflow into the atria when the ventricles contract. So remember, the ventricle contracts like that, so it's just pushing blood up and out the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. You want to close those AV valves so that you don't push blood back into the atria. That's what it's for. So you have a tricuspid and a mitral valve. Okay? And again, these valves are held in place by these heartstrings, these chordae tendineae, and they are held into the heart wall using papillary muscles. Then you have semilunar valves, and they prevent backflow into the ventricles when the ventricles relax. So the ventricles contract. When they relax, that blood was to fall back from the pulmonary trunk and from the aorta, and so to prevent the blood draining right back into the ventricles, you have these valves. So you have a pulmonary semilunar valve that prevents backflow into the right ventricle, and a aortic semilunar valve that prevents blood going back into the left ventricle. And again, if you were to do a dissection here of a cow heart, you could kind of look down into the vessels and actually see these valves from an anterior, from the top, from I guess a superior position. So this is your pulmonary semilunar valve, your aortic semilunar valve, your mitral or bicuspid, and your tricuspid valve. Okay? So just, again, tricuspid, this is the right side, and I know it's the right side because I can see the blue. Just kidding. Now I'm looking at the thickness of the heart wall, and I've also got my orientation. Okay, I know this is my interventricular septum. I can see my valve. I can see my pulmonary semilunar valve. So I'm in the right atrium, and I'm looking at tricuspid and pulmonary semilunar valves. On the left side, again, I'm looking at my bicuspid valve, and the aortic semilunar valve is kind of up in this little hole. And I believe I've got a picture. I think I should. I've got some more pictures. I'll show you another picture, but it's going to be kind of up in there. You have to actually, in the lab, you got to take the model and kind of bend it down to kind of to see in there. All right. So that's kind of the major structures of the heart. So now we want to talk about the coronary circulation. So even though you've got your heart and blood is flowing through the atrium and through the atria and through the ventricles, the heart's not able to use any of that blood. There's no exchange going on. But the cardiac muscle itself, it needs blood supply. It needs oxygen, and it needs sugars, and it needs everything it needs to have to make ATP so it can beat. And so the heart muscle wall itself has its own set of arteries and veins we call the coronary circulation. So think about the heart, it pumps to the lungs, the pulmonary circuit, it pumps to the body, which is the systemic circuit, and it pumps to the heart, which is the coronary circuit. So you have, there's several vessels. We're just going to focus on a couple, so you only have to learn the ones I'm going to talk to you today. You have 2 main arteries, and they come off right at the base of the aorta. So if you think about the aortic arch and you had those 3 branches, these are not the first. There's actually branches right off the beginning of the aorta, okay, because the heart's greedy. It takes its portion first. So you have a left coronary artery, and you have a right coronary artery. And the left coronary artery branches and becomes the anterior interventricular artery, and then the other branch becomes the circumflex artery. And these are going to supply the left side of the heart. So it's going to supply the interventricular septum, it's going to supply the anterior ventricular walls, the left atrium, and the posterior wall of the ventricle. So there's going to be little collateral arteries coming off of that to feed the entire left side of the heart. On the right side, you have the right coronary artery, and it has an offshoot called the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. And this is going to supply the right side, the right atrium, and the right ventricle. So this is a diagram, and then we're going to take this and show you what it looks like on the model. So here's the aorta, and so you've got these two little vessels, the first thing that comes off. So this is the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. The left coronary artery will divide into the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. It's also called the LAD, or the left anterior descending. Okay, so I will take either answer as correct. You should be familiar with both. It's the anterior interventricular artery or the left anterior descending, also known as the LAD. Some people even call it the widowmaker because it does supply such a large part of the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart is the major pumping side of the heart. So if you were to get a blockage and have a heart attack in the LAD, you would lose a lot of heart muscle wall and potentially have a very large heart attack, very damaging heart attack. The right coronary artery is going to come off and start to go kind of around behind the, kind of go to the back side, kind of circle around to the back of the heart. As it does that, you have several branches that come off, but we only want you to know a couple. So you have the right marginal artery, and then this is, pretend this is clear. You're kind of looking through the heart. This kind of a glass heart, if you will. And they're showing you on the back side of the heart, on the back septum, you have the posterior interventricular artery. Okay. So the blood is going to go out through the arteries, so it's going to return through the veins. Okay, so you have cardiac veins, cardiac arteries become cardiac capillaries, you have exchange occurring, now you have capillary beds, capillary veins bringing the blood back. All of your cardiac veins will drain into a coronary sinus, and then that sinus empties right back into the right atrium. Okay, so I showed you inside the atrium where the inferior and superior vena cava and the coronary sinus empty in. You only have to know 3 cardiac veins, the great one, the middle one, and the small one. Kind of sounds like a Starbucks commercial. All right, and so we'll talk about what that looks like. All right, and so, okay, so flipping forward, the coronary sinus is on the back side of the heart. So again, imagine this is a see-through heart. So you have the coronary sinus. So the middle cardiac vein, it runs alongside that posterior interventricular artery. So it's on the back side. You have the small cardiac vein. It runs alongside the marginal artery. Then you have the great cardiac vein, and it runs alongside the LAD. Okay, so if you know your 3 arteries, these are the 3 veins that match it. And all 3 veins are going to drain to that coronary sinus. All right, so again, I've got a diagram for you more as a reference. So again, you can see these same images in your textbook. They've got the coronary sinus marked. You have your middle cardiac vein and posterior interventricular arteries here. You can see your, let's see, what else can you see on here? That may be really all I want to point out right now. Oh, here's your great cardiac vein coming up in here. So again, so these are just more labeled reference points for you. So what's it look like on the model? Because that's what your test is going to be on. So here's looking the front of the heart again. Here's your aorta. Here's going to be your right coronary artery. Your left coronary artery is going to come out from behind the pulmonary trunk, and it's right there. Then immediately it branches to the circumflex artery and the LAD. Okay, this is the great cardiac vein that's going to be returning back to the coronary sinus. And let's go to another kind of okay here. Yeah, This is just a really nice view of that right coronary artery, and as you can see, it's going all the way around to the back side of the heart. And on this side, you have the left coronary artery. It's going to make the LAD, and then the circumflex artery going all the way around. If you're looking at the back side of the heart, this is going to be the posterior interventricular artery and the middle cardiac vein. So you're able to see these on the back side. And I should have, let's see, that's also, what is that? That looks weird. That is, oh, I'm showing the coronary sinus. Yeah, that's why I put that in here. I want to show you the coronary sinus and how that drains together. So you can see this coronary sinus here. This is again the posterior side so that you can see the great cardiac vein and the posterior interventricular artery. I think well, where's my marginal artery? Let's go back. So it's going to be, I need a better picture. So it's going to be like right here. You're going to have your marginal artery and vein. I think I've got another picture that's a little better. Your marginal artery and your small cardiac vein. I believe I have another picture in that other PowerPoint that's labeled that shows you a little bit better version of the marginal artery and small vein. So I think I've covered everything. Here's your pulmonary veins coming in on the left side. And I'm going to cut this off for today. So again, watch Miss Graham's version, and she'll be able to kind of turn the model all different directions and show you a little bit better some of the structures. And again, there's another PowerPoint. There's no video with it, but it does. You can look at the numbers, and you can look at your list of structures and kind of use that as a test. You know, just kind of say, okay, what number is this, and label it, and you should be prepared for your exam. And I'm going to quit. So thanks a lot, as usual.